Well, welcome to the 700 Club, and thanks for joining with us. Disturbing story coming out of Iran, where there's growing anger after a series of toxic chemical strikes against schoolgirls in cities across the country.
Mysterious gas has poisoned hundreds of students, and Chris Mitchell brings us this look at who may be behind these attacks.
On Tuesday, Iran announced the arrest of several unnamed suspects over the poisonings.
Based off intelligence work and research done by the country's intelligence bodies, authorities have identified and arrested some individuals in 5 provinces and are currently carrying out a full investigation.
The news follows reports that those experiencing symptoms have grown dramatically across hundreds of schools throughout Iran. The attacks began in late November in Qom, near the capital, Tehran. While most of the targets are girls' schools, Reuters notes at least one boys' school in western Iran was also hit. Some local media reports students saying they saw strange objects landing in schoolyards. Eyewitnesses add loud bangs being heard.
اولی چیزایی که انفجار اومد بعدش مدیر مدرسه از بلندگو اعلام کرد که حال بچه‌ها اینجوری شد و آمبولانس اومد.
For months, school authorities, the health ministry, and other government bodies either denied or downplayed the incidents. In the Supreme Leader's first public statement on the poisonings, Ali Khamenei said the culprits would receive the most severe penalty.
Officials must pursue this seriously. It's an important matter. If there's some hands behind this and some persons or groups are involved, this is a big and unforgivable crime.
Those opposing the regime call the attacks a revenge tactic against young Iranian women leading the revolutionary movement that erupted across Iran in September. Last year, Khamenei demanded punishment for those involved in the uprising. Farouk Kanani, a civil activist, tells CBN News that could be the motive for these attacks.
Punishment for the teenagers would be nice because they get aware of what they are doing. That's probably a so-called fatwa for many Islamists to follow that. And now it's, as I mentioned, kind of taking a revenge from the teenagers, especially schoolgirls.
While several officials have tried to blame foreign enemies for the attacks, families of students gathered in one Tehran school chanting, "Death to the child-killing regime." Widespread footage from social media shows a concerned mother being brutally attacked by plainclothes forces for demanding answers about her poisoned daughter. Other parents demanded to know why school security cameras were off when the poison gas spread. While the perpetrator's intent remains unclear, many believe it is the payback for the young women fighting against the regime and a deliberate attempt to force their schools to shut down. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, it does appear to be payback, and payback for protesting against what the Islamic regime is requiring them to do. Those protesters resulted because a woman walked the streets and her headgear was not quite in place. She had a scarf over her head, and it wasn't quite covering everything on her head. It wasn't quite covering her hair. And for that, she lost her life. In the aftermath, you see the protests, you see the call for change, and then the regime waits, sort of lies in waiting. It seems to allow it, and you say, okay, change is going to come to Iran. And then they come in with police. They arrest the leaders of them. There have been executions of those leaders, and their crime was protesting what the Islamic regime was requiring of its people. Now we see this, where they're poisoning schoolgirls, and you don't have to be, too much into conspiracy theories to see behind it. They're telling women, if you protest, this is what we're going to do to you. Your life is on the line. That's the message here. It's the message you need to fall into line and fall into our regulations and fall into what we want you to do. If you don't, we're going to kill you. Well, there's a huge development right now in the Middle East, and of all places for it to happen, it happened in Beijing, which shows the rise of Chinese influence in the Middle East. Iran and Saudi Arabia are reestablishing diplomatic relations. John Jessup has that story from the CBN newsroom. John?
That's right, Gordon. The two countries agreed to reestablish diplomatic relations and reopen embassies after years of tension. The deal, as Gordon just mentioned, was struck in Beijing this week, and it comes amid speculation about another possible major development in the Middle East. The Wall Street Journal reports the Saudis are asking the United States to provide security guarantees and to help develop its civilian nuclear program, reportedly what the Saudis want in exchange for normalizing relations with Israel. Well, in Germany, 8 people are dead after a shooting at a Jehovah's Witness hall. No word yet on a motive for the attack in Hamburg, which is the second largest city in the country. Police believe they were responding to one shooter who could be among the dead. An unknown number of others were also wounded, some of them seriously. Officers apparently reached the hall while the attack was still going on. A police spokesperson said they did not use their own firearms. One witness said he heard at least 25 shots. Germany's gun laws are more restrictive than here in the United States, but more permissive than some other European neighbors. While shootings there are rare, they are not unheard of. Well, here in Washington, the steam is still settling after the head of Norfolk Southern Railway and key government officials appeared at a heated hearing on Capitol Hill over the chemical train accident in East Palestine, Ohio. As CBN's Jenna Browder reports, senators had some tough questions.
An apology and promises of action were met with renewed demand for accountability following the toxic train derailment in Ohio. More than a month after the accident, senators got their chance to grill the head of the Norfolk Southern Train Company. A day of reckoning.
I want you to tell me why everybody in my community is getting sick.
And atonement.
I want to begin today by expressing how deeply sorry I am.
The chief of the company responsible for the derailment in the hot seat in the Senate.
Corporate greed, outdated railway safety regulations, lax hazardous material standards were all the fuel on a toxic fire that was ready to combust.
Norfolk Southern CEO Alan Shaw promising yet again to thoroughly clean the crash site and surrounding areas.
I am determined to make this right. Norfolk Southern will clean the site safely, thoroughly, and with urgency. You have my personal commitment.
Which means Norfolk Southern putting up millions for affected regions and touting a 6-point plan to improve rail safety, including enhanced real-time warnings to crews.
While this is Norfolk Southern's train, their wreck, and their mess, the entire apparatus of state government has been mobilized to assist.
With the toxic cleanup still underway, EPA representatives are vouching for the safety of the region's water and air.
EPA monitors have not detected any volatile organic compounds above levels of health concerns.
Now facing new questions over the intentional burning of certain hazardous chemicals carried by the train, including vinyl chloride, associated with increased cancer risks.
It's their responsibility, and they weren't even considered before this decision to vent and burn it in the middle of a town.
We were at risk of a catastrophic rupture that would have resulted in uncontrolled release of hazardous material.
Then how do we know that the car wasn't working properly to begin with? Someone may need to be held responsible that made the decision to burn this off.
As to the potential continuing environmental and health threat, a point-blank question.
Would you live there, given what you've seen?
Yes, sir.
And President Biden, after initially declining to visit the site of the toxic train crash, now says he intends to visit at some point. The Norfolk Southern chief and EPA representatives told Senator Graham they would join the president if asked to do so. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Jenna. Well, nearly $7 trillion. That's the cost of President Biden's new budget proposal. The White House maintains it will cut nearly $3 trillion from the deficit over the next decade. But opponents quickly criticized its major tax increases. And as CBN's Caitlin Burke reports, it's expected to go nowhere in a divided Congress.
When it comes to spending, Congress holds the purse strings. While the Senate may be able to push the plan through, the Republican-controlled House has already deemed the budget dead on arrival.
I ran to grow the economy from the middle out and the bottom up and not the top down.
Biden's budget proposals fall into 4 main categories: deficit reduction, bringing down costs for families, protecting and strengthening Medicare and Social Security, and investing in America. Many of the president's plans also involve raising taxes, which Republicans call unnecessary.
If you look at the revenue that's coming into America today, it's higher than at any 50-year average. We've only topped this 2 other times that we've met at the same time. But our expenses are much higher. And if you look since he's been in office, the added $6 trillion. If you look at the 30% increase in discretionary spending just in the last 4 years, that has been a real challenge. And I think that's where the real problem lies.
Democrats, meanwhile, accuse the GOP of targeting programs that average Americans rely on, like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, to try to achieve a balanced budget.
Their fantastical plan, I call it fantastical, to balance the budget in 10 years would decimate the middle class, decimate the wallets of every American family, and undo the progress we've made over the last 2 years.
McCarthy maintains cuts to those programs are off the table. As Congress argues over how to bring down the national debt, both sides agree something must be done. U.S. debt currently sits at $32 trillion, expected to reach $50 trillion by 2030.
In the next 10 years, Americans will pay $10.5 trillion just on the interest on our debt. Now, to put that in perspective, since 1940 till today, America has only paid $9 trillion in interest. So in the next 10 years, we'll pay more than we paid in the last 80 years.
I'm ready to meet with the Speaker anytime, tomorrow, if he has his budget. Lay it down, tell me what you want to do, I'll show you what I want to do, see what we can agree on, what we don't agree on, let's see what we vote on.
Even before this budget proposal, lawmakers have looked ahead to another money issue, the debt ceiling. With the government set to run out of money by mid-August, the country could default if Congress doesn't raise it, something Republicans say they're unwilling to do until they see some concessions on spending. Caitlin Burke, CBN News, Washington.
And Gordon, political analysts are describing the proposal more as a campaign document than an actual budget.
Well, I would agree it is a campaign document, and both parties are politicking off of it. But I've been warning since the deficit first crossed $20 trillion that we were spending ourselves into a hole that even our grandchildren aren't going to be able to dig out of. We've gone off the rails, and at $30 trillion, when you start adding up the interest payment alone, I mean, listen to what the House Speaker said. Over the next 10 years, $10 trillion in just interest payments. That's a phenomenal number. That means before the Congress even meets to consider a budget, you and I have got to come up with $1 trillion in taxes just to pay the interest rate on the previous debt. Now, you can say, okay, well, let's just do that and take that as a cost of moving forward. But if you continue to take the deficit up, and the projection right now is $50 trillion, at what point do the financial markets start to recognize, well, you can't pay that bill. We're not going to buy your bonds anymore. Here's an economic headline. I'm sorry for getting wonky with you, but it's one that may have missed your radar. There's a bank in California that just took a roughly $2 billion hit, and that caused all the banks yesterday on Wall Street to sell off. The reason they took that hit wasn't based on loan losses or trading losses. It was based on they had to restructure their bond portfolio because the bonds they were holding were paying a lower interest rates than the bonds that they could buy in the market today. So that deficit, that hit they took to their capital was a restructuring of their bond ladders. You know, that sounds esoteric, doesn't it? But it means that every bank in America is having to do that in order to keep up with how much bonds are costing right now. And their older bonds are worth less because the interest rate's being paid less. So as the Federal Reserve is forced to fight inflation, to increase interest payments, and the federal government is issuing bonds now at higher interest rates, that's shaking up everything. That affects you and me on what we pay on credit card interest. It affects you and me on what we pay on a new home loan. If we have to refinance, what does that mean? If we have to take out a loan for home repairs, what does that mean? All of these things will absolutely affect you. But the thing nobody's talking about, if the federal government is unable to pay its interest obligations, well, then our whole currency goes up in smoke. That's a big deal. That affects all of us. And we're all at fault. Republicans, Democrats, we've all contributed to this deficit. We all need to wake up and say, how much government can we afford? Can we afford all these spending programs, all these giveaway programs, all of this stuff? And can we get some fiscal sanity to say, please, can we balance a budget and can we do it right now? If you have that attitude and you put everything on the table, well, then you'll protect our children, you'll protect our grandchildren. If we keep spending, well, maybe we'll make it through my lifetime without a currency collapse, but we see it coming. And I wish more people would raise the alarm. You can't have this kind of spending go on and on and on without some very serious consequences.